Hello, today is November 12th, 2010. My name is Eloísa Echazábal and I'm a former Pedro Pan child. And I have the pleasure and the honor of having with us today Mr. Chris Baker and Dr. Dennis Baker. They are the sons of Mr. James Baker. He is the person who, together with Monsignor Walsh, started the Pedro Pan program, the Cuban, unaccompanied Cuban Children's Exodus program, back in 1960. And we're going to be, talking, and I've already provided them with some questions. And so Chris and Dennis, would you please tell us where you were born, and if you were born in the United States, when you went to Cuba?
Well, we were both born in Flint, Michigan, where my parents were working at the time. They had come back from Cuba in 1936 because my mother wanted to go to graduate school and my father did some more graduate work. And after they finished that, they took a job teaching in Michigan. So I was born in 1938 and Chris was born in 1941. We stayed here until 1944 when the family returned to Cuba. My parents went back to help with running Ruston Academy.
Mm-hmm. So your parents had been in Cuba for a long time.
They were there my father first went in 1930 because there were no jobs for teachers during the Depression. And then he fell in love with the country, came back in 1932 and got married, and then they were both there until 1936. So they were there during the Machadato. They had their first experience with the revolution.
Right. Would you describe your life in Cuba? So you arrived in Cuba, what were your ages?
3.5 and 5.5.
Oh, okay. So.
Well, we were privileged in many ways that we weren't the typical foreigner living in Cuba. We were among that limited group of Americans who basically went to Cuba and stayed there. And if you go back over time and you see some of the things that Dad has talked about in some interviews that I know there are recordings of, we were just looking at one last night, he referred to himself not as a Cuban American but as an American Cuban. Mm-hmm. And he felt that Cuba really had become our country, and we felt the same way. So that we really lived between. We had the best of both cultures, mm-hmm. in that we spent time in American environments and we spent time in Cuban environments, and quite frankly, one of the reasons that Denny and I both have fairly fluent Spanish is the fact that the first place that we lived, which was Tercera entre E y F, right across the street from the Balneario Los Baños.
That was in El Vedado.
In Vedado. The school was at Hey Quinta, so we were just a couple of blocks away, but there were literally no other Americans around. There was maybe one family within...
Well, that was later.
And that was later. So that when we played outside, we were playing in Spanish.
Right.
So we really, absorbed it through the pores. Even more so than others who, to this day, there are people who lived in Cuba longer than we did, perhaps. Some of them actually had been born there, mm-hmm. but they had been in the American community.
Right.
So that we literally had the best of both.
Yeah, and you had the benefit of the school, the children that attended school, and you socialized with them and interacted with them and all that. And so would you describe your father, James Baker, and his role at the Ruston Academy?
Well, from what we know, when he first went there in 1930, it was a very small school. Mm-hmm. It had a boarding department, and he helped out with the boarders, with the male boarders. And later on, they started taking girls, but initially it was just boys. So when he was there, initially he was there primarily as one of a small group of teachers. The school was run by Mr. Ruston, who established it. And then when he came back in 1944, he was asked to come back as director of the school, because by this time Mr. Ruston was getting older, did not have the energy or the will to want to deal with all the day-to-day problems, so that Dad came back as director of the upper school, and Mother was director of the lower school, kindergarten through grade 6.
So both of them were associated.
They were both teachers, and very committed to the teaching. So when they came back in 44, then they had leadership roles from then on. In 1946 or 47, Mr. Ruston died, and then my father remained as the sole leader. The school was owned by Mr. Ruston and his sister, Miss Ruston. She survived for another 2 years, and then after she died, the school passed. My parents inherited ownership of the school, and my father and mother felt that it was not appropriate to have an important thing like a school owned by individual people, and they created what I think was the first nonprofit foundation in Cuba.
We know that it was the first nonprofit education.
But it took them
Maybe
about
the only one.
6 months to figure out how to describe nonprofit foundation in legal
Spanish.
terms in Spanish. And there was about 6 pages in the document explaining what it was. But anyway, they established it as a nonprofit foundation with themselves as directors at the time, but created a board of directors that was a mixture of Cubans and Americans who were established in the community and who had a strong interest in the school. So that's when the board of directors really became an important part of the school.
But you were asking, what Dad was like. I think that one of his strongest traits was he had very, very strong commitment to values, and he was very, very focused and disciplined. And this explains how the school went from what Mr. Ruston had been able to accomplish and set up to what the school was like in 1957, 58, 59, 60, and then finally the school was intervened in 1961. No, it was in 1961.
January of 61.
Also explains Dad's commitment to what happened with the Pedro Pan organization. And I would say that Dios guarde cruzar a Jim Baker cuando viene bien enfocado.
Sí.
He was a man who felt very strongly about, as did my mother. My mother was un poco, she had more of a velvet touch. Sometimes Dad was pretty heavy-handed. But essentially, he was the kind of person who challenged you constantly.
Wow.
And it was, when we were putting together, when Dad was writing the book about Ruston Academy that we finally were able to publish after his death, he tried to get input from students of what did they remember, what was significant in their memories. And quite a few talked about the fact that they were challenged, maybe for the first time, some said. Others, we were very challenged by, we couldn't just get by pasando. You had to be the best. You had to do things to the best of your capability. So that I think this explains a lot of Jim Baker.
Yeah, and he motivated the students that way.
Well, and another thing that I think was equally important, he not only did that himself, but he, over the years, selected teachers who had the same way of thinking and the same commitment, the same. I mean, people will always say, I had Doctora Ferrer, I had Boris Goldenberg as my teacher. You know, and when I got when I got to college, it was easy because Nuendorf made me learn how to write well, and Doctora Ferrer taught me how to do mathematics to the perfection, and you know, so that he accumulated a core of people who shared the same value and forced the students to the same level.
Well, I just interviewed Margarita Oteiza not too long ago, and she was first she was a student,
Yes.
and she graduated, and then she became a professor, and she was saying the same thing, how well prepared the students at Ruston were, because then when they came to the United States, they passed their tests, you know, those whatever the SATs, it's been a long time for me. So, and they got into the real great universities, and so she was telling us the same thing. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about the school was that there were so many tracks going on at the same time, because you had Cuban students who were coming in sometimes at a level of first-year bachillerato, and they didn't have the English, or they had some English, and you had Americans and other foreign students who were coming in who didn't speak Spanish at all sometimes. So that you had a program where there was a Spanish track that was multi-layered as well as the English, and yet, for example, the ability of putting the best of everything together really came through. And for example, to our knowledge, Ruston Academy was the only school in Cuba that offered the possibility, primarily to Cuban students, to get both a bachillerato degree and a high school.
That's what I learned too. Yeah. Okay, now please describe those years of the Cuban Revolution, 1959, 1960.
You have to say which revolution.
Oh, yes, is there another one? Vis-a-vis your parents' role at Ruston, you know, like when Fidel took over, and how did things start to change?
Well, I probably have a better sense of that because by the time that Fidel came to power, Denny was away at college. Although he was in Havana when when Batista fled. In fact,
January 1st, 1959.
Exactly.
We all remember that day.
And I didn't graduate until I graduated from high school in June. So I was there for the first until September of 1959, and then I was away at college myself, so that we don't have a good recollection or detailed knowledge of what happened in that period of 1960 where we weren't really around.
Right.
But I think that you would have to say that my family was elated that at the defeat of the salida of the Batista regime. And in fact, I can remember the 1st of January very well because Dad had actually been, we on occasion had students, teachers who had been in, that Dad knew were involved in certain kinds of anti-governmental activities.
Sure.
Who spent a night or two in our house because they were being looked for. So there were links, information that was flowing. Actually, a person who shows up or should show up in the history of Pedro Pan is Serafina Jiquel. Serafina Jiquel was the person who did the garden work for the school, the landscaping.
Yeah, she designed it.
And voluntarily.
Oh.
There was no payment made to her. But she and her husband and dad and mother knew each other quite well. And essentially, we got information that Batista had fled about 2 o'clock in the morning of the 1st.
That was early.
So, yeah, there were those kinds of contacts, so that we were somewhat unique in that respect as well.
Sure. Yeah, you.
Well, and the other thing that I think is important is that my parents, although they felt that Batista, it would be good for him to go, they had friends on both sides. At one point, they had people downstairs drinking champagne to celebrate. Someone came with a bottle of champagne, and upstairs was the family of Blanco Rico, you know, the general who was shot earlier the previous year. And they were in school, and Dad said, if there's any problem, you come here until we straighten out what's going to happen to your family.
And it happened.
But essentially, to fill that one out, Eloísa, that was January 1st. By September of 1960,
Yeah.
they, like many in
Oh,
Cuba,
yes.
were beginning to question what
Like my
was happening.
family and
Yeah.
people I know.
And so it was a transition. By the time that they left, they had already become involved in, you know, what I'm sure you will be getting into, which
Yes.
is the initial activities that led to the creation of a much broader activity of the Pedro Pan
Right.
movement, organization, effort.
I've heard that the way it started, it was parents of students of Ruston came to Mr. Baker asking him how they could get their children out. I mean, can you tell us how? Let's move on to that Pedro Pan Exodus part. now.
Okay,
So,
you have to,
Yeah.
we weren't in Cuba when that happened, so certainly over the years we talked, Dad talked to
Right.
us about it, but essentially as we understand it, there were a series of parents who were involved in
The new underground.
in new underground activities. And they were concerned about their children being taken either away from them or sent to, you know, as it happened during the Spanish Revolution or the Civil War in Spain, to Russia, etc. And that these parents had, many of whom, well, all of whom knew Dad quite well, so much so that they trusted him to go and say, look, is there anything that
That's
you
right.
can do to help? And essentially, Dad tried to find a way in which these children could in fact be taken care of if they left Cuba. And
Well, also how to get them out of Cuba.
right. So that this all occurred in a very, I was just going over the history, and it's a very compressed period of time because
The first ones, I think, he started to get involved with this maybe as early as the end of summer of '60.
right,
Because that's why, it was very clear.
Yeah.
What was interesting is, almost without exception, these people who were concerned were people who were supporters of the revolution.
yes.
But they were now on the inside and began to see very clearly what direction was
Where it was
being,
going.
where it was going. And they, I mean, we were talking about very intelligent people who had chosen to support Fidel more because he was against Batista than because he was Fidel. I mean, a lot of the people that we knew, you know, it was sort of anything to get rid of Batista, and it happened to be Fidel who filled the leadership vacuum, and that's where they went. But I think as early as early summer, people were already beginning to get, some people, in talking to Dad and talking to other people, it was people were beginning to get very upset with the direction. Well, the first thing that I think that made it very clear to some people was the fact that he abolished all labor unions within the first 2 months. I mean, the first thing he did was abolish any strength outside of his own. And people began to say, now wait a minute, this isn't what's right for the country.
This is not what we
So
thought
it was
was
very
right.
early. So I think that by early summer, people were beginning to have very strong second thoughts about what's going on here. And I think through the summer, people began to realize that they might have to be against the government. Now, part of the problem was that these were people, I mean, a lot of people who were on the pro-revolution side were given positions in the government. So now you had some people who were very capable, who realized that they were in the government, but they wanted out.
And they didn't like what was going
And the
on.
story that I heard from my father was that they said, and this was, he heard this several times, was that my wife and I are willing to take our chances and to leave in the middle of the night on a boat, but we can't put our young children through this, and we can't be in a position where they can be used against us as hostages. And so is there any way that we can get them out? We know that we can't get out, that we have to stay, but we want to know that our children are out of the country where nothing can happen to them. That's sort of the theme that came through initially and I think that's what got Dad.
And then I've read the story that he came to the United States looking to see how he could solve that, and then he happened to meet Father Walsh.
Yeah, Father Walsh.
And then they both got together and started to develop the program.
Well, I think that there is a sense that this really took place over, that his involvement was much more extensive than it truly was. His work was carried out between September and December because Dad and Mother left when diplomatic relations were broken because they felt it was no longer safe for them to stay. The school continued for another 5 months until it was expropriated in May, along with all other private schools. But essentially it was between September and December that his activities were carried out, and it was focused. His involvement was not as much with the 14,000 that eventually came out. It opened the door to what followed.
And then the second part of what he did was what he did in Miami, especially in the first 6 months, because when he came out, they were just beginning to get increasing numbers out, and there was no infrastructure to deal with it. And Catholic Relief and Father Walsh were involved, but he got very much involved for the first, more so in the first 6 months, because he essentially volunteered. He borrowed Father Walsh's car and went out to the airport and waited for airplanes.
Because they had no systems in place yet.
No, they had nothing in place, and what they did, they were just sort of, what they wanted to do is to make sure that something was available, so if a kid got off a plane, there wasn't something immigration would send them to, children care services or something like that. So they just simply met all the planes coming out of Havana and Jamaica. Ultimately, they had somebody hired on the staff who did this work, but he did a lot of it, and in some cases, children are told, well, you're going on a trip and Mr. Baker will take care of you.
That's right. As a matter of fact, I was telling you earlier, my very good friend Susana Gomez and her brother came in the early part of 1961, and they were met by Mr. Baker at the airport. As a matter of fact, she was just telling me today that she had seen Mr. Baker in Cuba because she attended Ruston Academy school, which was just down the street from her. And she had attended an event at Ruston. So she had seen him once, but she didn't know that he was going to meet the airplane. And she says that when she and her brother saw Jim Baker there meeting them, she knew that they were safe. That's what she said. And then he drove them to Kettle Camp, and they made them he made them feel so relaxed and safe and all that. So at least I know one through
Well,
personal
I think
experience.
that it's very important that those people who came out and were met by Dad know that he held them in the highest of esteem because he felt that it was very difficult to imagine the steel that is required in order to go through something like
Sure.
that. And I remember at an event that was held here in Miami some years ago honoring his work by the Peter Pan organization, he essentially said, you know, I'm not the hero, you are the heroes. And he really was convinced of that.
Mhm. And I also read something that he said about the parents.
Mhm.
You know, that he just felt that the parents, you know, were the brave
Right,
ones.
One of the most difficult things, I think, for the parents was that they essentially had to lie to the children, because one of the rules was the children must not know where they're going. They're going on a trip and someone will take care of you. In most cases, that
Like who
was.
was going to take care of them?
Or they're
like
going to
everything.
Jamaica. That was, oh, you're going to have a vacation in Jamaica. And that was the only piece of information they had.
Most of
And
them.
the fact that they would get off one plane, get on another plane, end up in Miami later that day was never part of the discussion.
Going back to Cuba for a moment, did you ever meet Penny Powers?
No.
No, she was a
There-
professor there.
No, I remember asking Dad at one point if he remembered Penny Powers, and he didn't. If Penny Powers taught at Ruston, it must have been when Dad and Mother weren't there, in that period between 36 and 44. Through reading, I've learned that there are questions that have been raised about Penny Powers' role. I think in an interview that Dad did, he did say that it was his understanding that once Serafina Hiquel was under arrest and Berta Finley and her husband Frank were out of the picture, that Penny Powers had become a important figure. But we did not know her by name or meeting her, other than by what we've
Excuse me.
read in the past few years.
Okay, did you ever meet Monsignor Walsh?
No.
Okay. Back to your dad. He was also, I think, he was one of the first foster parents in one of the houses
Yes,
here in Miami.
He initially, when he first came, he wanted to help out, and whether he could not get a job short term, my mother was able to get a job immediately, and she started working to help support them because they obviously didn't have any money. And he wasn't able to get a job, and he was told, you know, we can probably get you a job.
It's okay, I got it.